You're standing in the Thar Desert in Rajasthan. The air is thick, the ground is scorched. And then, the sky shatters. A fighter jet tears across the horizon at twice the speed of sound. It's violent, it's terrifying, and it's over in a second. That violent speed is exactly what the Indian defense establishment was desperate for. By the early 2000s, India was trying to protect a population of 1.4 billion people, while sandwiched between two nuclear-armed neighbors, Pakistan to the west and China to the north. And the shield protecting those borders was rusting. The backbone of the Indian Air Force was a fleet of aging Soviet-era MiG-21s. These aircraft were designed for a different era of warfare. Pilots had even started calling them flying coffins. Meanwhile, Beijing was methodically acquiring stealth tech and fifth-generation fighters. Islamabad was buying F-16s. India was falling behind. A sovereign nation cannot hold off 21st-century threats with 20th-century metal. The gap between what India had and what its rivals were building was becoming a fatal liability. So in 2007, New Delhi sent out a call. They needed 126 new multi-role combat aircraft to entirely replace that dying fleet and lock down Indian skies. It was estimated to be worth up to $20 billion. The global aerospace industry lined up. You had the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Swedish Gripen, the Russian MiG-35, and from the United States came Boeing's Super Hornet and Lockheed Martin's F-16, jets backed by the entire political and industrial weight of the U.S. defense industry. After years of exhaustive trials, India chose the French entry, the Dassault Rafale. It was chosen for its extraordinary multi-role capabilities, its AESA radar, and crucially because France had a history of selling weapons without the heavy political strings attached to American hardware. France celebrated. Dassault had won. But years after that announcement, the Indian Air Force didn't have a single new jet on the tarmac. Choosing a fighter plane and actually taking possession of it are two completely different things. To understand why the deal froze, you have to look at India's procurement rules. They demanded three things from any massive defense contract: technology transfer, financial offsets, and domestic manufacturing. The plan was simple. France would build the first 18 jets. The remaining 108 would be built right here by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, or HAL, India's state-owned aerospace manufacturer. But Dassault's engineers took one look at HAL's production lines and drew a hard line. Under the original tender, Dassault was supposed to guarantee the quality of every single jet. They refused to accept liability for aircraft they didn't assemble themselves. A single crash ruins a manufacturer's global reputation. Dassault wouldn't risk theirs. By trying to force a domestic manufacturing leap, India had inadvertently trapped its own air force in a contractual black hole. While the public focused on hangar disputes, a separate disagreement formed over the Rafale's software architecture. The SPECTRA electronic warfare system and the RBE-2 radar both function through proprietary French code. SPECTRA is the jet's electronic brain. It blinds incoming missiles and jams enemy tracking. And France flatly refused to hand over the source code that makes it work. This source code functions as a vault for French signals intelligence. It encodes specific radar frequencies and electronic emission signatures that France has refined through decades of real-world operations. This created an operational chokehold. If India wanted to load its own domestically built missiles onto the Rafale, they would need French involvement to modify the software. Every update and every change would require Paris to sign off. And then there was the ghost in the room. New Delhi has a long military history with Moscow. France feared that if they handed over the source code to India, those NATO-level evasion secrets would eventually leak to Russia. Without the source code, India's operational independence is permanently compromised. They can fly the aircraft, but they cannot modify how the machine thinks or how it identifies a threat without French cooperation. While New Delhi and Paris argued over code, the rest of the world saw an opportunity. Washington quietly stepped in, pitching government-to-government sales of F-16s, trying to pull India's nuclear delivery capability back into an American-controlled supply chain. Beijing watched the negotiations closely. A fully equipped Rafale fleet was a massive threat to the J-10s China operated across its borders. They had immense economic leverage over European aerospace partners and the means to introduce friction. Meanwhile, Islamabad went directly to Washington. Pakistan aggressively lobbied American think tanks and officials, trying to derail this qualitative leap in Indian air dominance. But the fiercest resistance was coming from inside the house. India's own defense bureaucracy is notoriously slow. AAL and its political supporters fiercely protected their institutional pride, resisting any compromise that would cut their manufacturing share. What started as a simple request for 126 airplanes had mutated into a global siege. It was a stress test of India's geopolitical leverage and its internal cohesion. Years vanished. From 2012 to 2015, defense ministers changed, meetings dragged on, and the paperwork piled up. Yet, there were 0 finalized contracts. Out in the real world, the clock was ticking. In 2015, 2 major earthquakes struck Nepal, demanding an immense aerial response. Terrorist attacks hit Indian soil. China rapidly expanded its air bases in Tibet. The incoming Modi administration inherited a breaking point. The Indian Air Force's squadron strength was falling dangerously below authorized levels. The threat was real, and the planes were old. The 36-jet deal that was eventually signed provided the hardware, but left the source code in French hands. India had secured the jets, but its path to genuine aerospace autonomy was still blocked. In April 2015, the original MMRCA deal for 126 combat aircraft had spent 3 years in negotiation hell. Price talks had collapsed, production guarantees were deadlocked, and a deal 14 years in the making was effectively over. Narendra Modi arrived in Paris and made a drastic executive decision. He scrapped the original framework entirely, opting for an emergency government-to-government purchase to bypass the bureaucratic deadlock. The announcement sent immediate shockwaves. The scale of the purchase dropped from 126 aircraft down to 36. There would be no licensed production in India. These would be fully built French jets delivered straight to the Indian Air Force. Political critics immediately targeted the loss of technology transfer. They questioned how a nation pursuing self-reliance could abandon indigenous production for a significantly smaller batch of imported hardware. However, the pivot reflected a brutal mathematical calculation. As India's air defense capability deteriorated, the government prioritized immediate aerial survival over a domestic manufacturing dream that had stayed stalled for over a decade. To turn a sudden political declaration into actual metal on a tarmac, India needed a specialized group of operators who could force a complex contract through both French and Indian bureaucracy. Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar led the process with an unsentimental, direct energy. Parrikar locked the teams into 8-hour technical briefings, cutting through procedural fog to lock in a firm price and specific combat configuration. In Paris, Ambassador Vinay Mohan Quatra worked to maintain the momentum. While the deal faced political turbulence back in India, Quatra managed the specific sensitivities of the French defense establishment, ensuring the relationship remained steady throughout 2 years of follow-on negotiations. The most delicate work happened backstage. National Security Advisor Ajit Doval managed the sensitive question of what classified technical data India would receive, bartering for maximum access to French systems without compromising the entire deal. Together, these operators navigated a strict compromise. They agreed to concede certain elements of long-term technical sovereignty to secure an immediate physical injection of combat capability. When the final contract was signed in 2016, it triggered an immediate controversy over the sticker price. 36 aircraft, along with weapons, training, and maintenance, would cost roughly $8 billion. The per-aircraft price had increased because the 2016 contract moved past the standard base model in favor of an airframe heavily modified for the Indian subcontinent. The new agreement accounted for the engineering costs of integrating third-party systems into the Rafale's French architecture. That premium paid for hardware enhancements, including compatibility with Israeli electronics and integration with the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile. These modifications were non-negotiable requirements for operating in India's specific combat environment. The jets also received customized electronic warfare enhancements designed specifically to counter regional threats, along with new low observability features tailored for the subcontinent. While the massive price premium became the center of a political scandal, the defense establishment viewed it as the necessary cost of preparing the aircraft for a simultaneous two-front war. The financial debate dominated the headlines, yet the deal's most consequential hidden cost was the standoff over the aircraft's source code, the digital brain of the fighter. This diagram shows the software architecture India actually obtained. The outermost layer is the object code, the compiled, executable software. Access to this layer allows the Indian Air Force to operate the systems, perform domestic software updates for India-specific modules, and integrate their own weapons, like the DRDO Astra missile. But looking at the center of the system reveals what India was denied. The fundamental algorithms for the RBE-2 radar and the SPECTRA electronic warfare suite remain under French sovereign control. This creates a tangible limitation. India cannot update its threat libraries or modify the jet's electronic warfare behavior without French cooperation. If regional threats change, New Delhi remains dependent on Paris to adjust the software. The operators purchased a world-class physical asset, but they accepted a calculated, delayed vulnerability. For now, the digital intelligence of India's premier strike aircraft remains the property of a foreign state. The first 5 Rafales touched down at the Ambala Air Force Station in July 2020. It was a moment of massive national relief, as the Chief of Air Staff formally received the aircraft into the Golden Arrow Squadron. This chart illustrates the brutal mathematics beneath the celebration. The Air Force requires 42 active squadrons to secure the country's borders. Even with all 36 Rafales delivered, the overall fleet strength remains stuck at approximately 30 squadrons. Closing that gap with a follow-on order for 114 more jets is becoming increasingly difficult. French production lines are currently overwhelmed by the war in Ukraine and competing contracts with nations like the UAE. Meanwhile, the threat across the Himalayas is modernizing rapidly. The People's Liberation Army Air Force is already operating J-20 stealth fighters in significant numbers, and its air defense systems have improved dramatically since the 2020 Palwan Valley clash. The Rafale deal provided a critical capability, but it also highlighted a hard truth. Strategic autonomy cannot be purchased off the shelf. Until India builds its own aircraft using its own source code, it remains vulnerable to the nations that do.